I never expected my sister Lisa's wheelchair would end up chained to our front porch, especially not by the president of our homeowners association, HOA. It was revealed that an undercover FBI agent had been monitoring our neighborhood for some time. This situation raises an important question. How far would you go to ensure your family remains free from unwarranted restrictions imposed by those who are supposed to safeguard your community? The sound of metal scraping against concrete jolted me awake at 5:30 a.m. Still in my pajamas, I rushed to the front door and was shocked to see two men in HOA uniforms wrapping a heavy chain around Lisa's wheelchair, securing it to the porch railing with a large padlock. Confused and angry, I shouted, "What are you doing? That's my sister's wheelchair." The taller man handed me a notice, stating, "Mobility devices must be stored out of sight per HOA Bylaw 23.4. This is your third warning." I was taken aback. We hadn't received any prior warnings. Lisa had only moved in with me 3 months earlier, following a car accident that left her paralyzed from the waist down. "Ma'am, please take it up with the board," the second man said hurriedly as they climbed into their golf cart and drove off. I tried to break the chain, but it was far too strong. Lisa appeared in the doorway, using her crutches for support, and asked, "What's happening, Sam?" I could hear the tremor in her voice. She had worked diligently in physical therapy to gain her independence with her wheelchair. "This has to be a mistake," I replied, trying to sound calm for her sake. "I'll get this sorted out right away." I called a locksmith, but he informed me he couldn't arrive until the afternoon. Meanwhile, Lisa was in tears. "I have a job interview today. I can't miss it," she said, devastated at having to rely on me again. I helped her into my car and got her to the interview, but her distress lingered. While she was gone, I took the time to read through all 94 pages of our HOA guidelines. I found the rule about mobility equipment needing to be stored inside or in designated areas, but it was evident that the rule was intended for items like bikes and scooters, not for medical devices. When the locksmith finally arrived, he cut the chain, which cost me $175 for the emergency service. As he worked, my neighbor, Diane Peterson, walked by with 3 garden gnomes that clearly weren't authorized by the HOA. "Such a shame what Barbara's doing to you folks," she whispered. "Barbara Thompson, the HOA president," I replied, and Diane nodded knowingly. "She dislikes any changes in the neighborhood." The Millers faced a tough situation after their son received a service dog. That evening, I reached out to the Homeowners Association HOA board via email. If you've made it this far and are enjoying the drama of these HOA stories, you're not alone. Don't miss out on the rest of the story. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for even more shocking twists. Explaining my sister Lisa's disability and asking for a special accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Within an hour, I received a response. It shocked me. My request for exemption was denied, and I was instructed to remove the unauthorized wheelchair ramp at our front entrance within 48 hours. I couldn't believe it. The ramp had been approved by the city, and I had all the necessary permits. The following day, I called the city planning office to double-check, and they confirmed everything was in order. However, upon returning home, I found a $500 fine taped to my door for supposed unauthorized modifications. Outside, I noticed Barbara Thompson taking pictures of our house from the sidewalk. She was in her early 60s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and dressed in a pricey tennis outfit, even though she never used the community courts. I approached her calmly and said, "Can we talk about this situation? My sister Lisa has a disability." Before I could finish, she interrupted, stating, "Your sister's condition doesn't allow you to lower property values for everyone else." I pointed out that the wheelchair ramp was hardly noticeable from the street, and chaining someone in a wheelchair seemed not only harsh but likely illegal too. Her response? A narrowed gaze as she suggested that perhaps Willow Creek wasn't the right community for us. As she walked away, I noticed she paid no attention to the holiday inflatables still displayed by the Petersons or to Mr. Rivera's boat parked in his driveway, which also violated HOA rules. That night, I dove into researching disability laws and learned that the HOA's actions clearly infringed on federal protections. I printed out the relevant laws to bring with me to the HOA meeting scheduled for the following evening. When I arrived at the community center for the meeting, I immediately felt the tension in the air. 20 neighbors halted their conversations, watching as I took a seat in the back row. Barbara was at the front table with several other board members. During the open comments section, I raised my hand, but Barbara repeatedly skipped over me. After several attempts, I stood up. "I'd like to address the board about disability accommodations and the chaining of medical equipment," I stated loudly. Barbara's face turned bright red. "That's not on tonight's agenda. Sit down or you'll be removed," she snapped. To my surprise, my neighbor Kevin Jackson stood up. "I want to hear what Sam has to say. My mother uses a wheelchair too." Finally, Barbara reluctantly allowed me 3 minutes to speak. I took a deep breath, ready to explain Lisa's situation. She handled the situation calmly and passed around copies of the ADA requirements. Some neighbors nodded in agreement. I had gathered evidence of selective enforcement of HOA rules in our community, including photographs. As I showed everyone my folder of pictures, documenting various violations that had gone unpunished at certain homes, it became clear that inconsistencies existed. When Barbara ended the meeting, her gavel striking the table abruptly, everyone began to leave. Kevin stepped toward me and whispered, "Be careful. Barbara has friends on the city council, but you're not alone in this." As I drove home, a mix of worry and determination filled my mind. Upon arriving at my driveway, my heart sank. Yellow eviction notices were plastered all over my front door. I quickly realized they weren't even real. They were fake HOA documents designed to look official. I tore them down before Lisa saw them and started to worry more. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of drilling. When I ran outside, I saw 2 men installing a security camera on the light post directly facing my house. "What's going on?" I asked. The installer replied without making eye contact, "HOA security upgrades. All common areas are getting cameras." But this camera wasn't aimed at a common area. It was right at my front door. I called my friend Mia, who is a real estate lawyer. "They can't do this," she said after I explained everything. "Make sure to document all of it and get a camera of your own." That afternoon, I set up a doorbell camera. Within an hour, Barbara Thompson approached my porch and slipped another notice into my mailbox. My camera caught her smirking at my door. This notice was for another fine, $750 for making false accusations against the board. A handwritten note at the bottom read, "Payment plans available if needed. We understand disabilities can be financially straining." That felt like the last straw. I decided to create a private neighborhood Facebook group called Willow Creek Transparency and invited everyone except board members. By the evening, 50 neighbors had joined. I shared my documented evidence of selective rule enforcement, complete with time-stamped photos. The comments started flooding in. Neighbors noted that while I was fined $300 for my daughter's basketball hoop, they ignored the identical one at the treasurer's house. Others mentioned Barbara's son parking his commercial truck at her house every weekend, which violated HOA rules. Additionally, I had requested approval for a solar panel, only to find one was granted to Barbara's friend shortly thereafter. The following morning, someone slipped a large envelope under my door. Inside were financial documents related to the HOA's dealings. I found documents that revealed the HOA paid $45,000 to a landscaping company owned by Barbara's brother for work that was never finished. The note I received said, "I'm on the budget committee. There's more. Be careful who you trust." I made copies and secured the originals in my safe. Later, when Lisa went to physical therapy, I drove to the county records office. There, the property maps confirmed something important. My wheelchair ramp was built entirely within my property line, not on the common areas as the HOA claimed. That afternoon, 3 board members, including Barbara, knocked on my door. With a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, Barbara said they wanted to offer a compromise. "We will allow temporary use of the wheelchair, provided it's covered with an approved neutral-colored tarp when outside." I kept my tone calm. That's not a reasonable accommodation under federal law. I'd also like to discuss the financial records showing HOA funds paid to your brother's company. I could see Barbara go pale, and the other board members exchanged worried glances. "You're making a big mistake," Barbara hissed. "I've been running this community for 15 years. People who challenge me don't last long here." After they left, I noticed a white van parked across the street. It was there again the next day and the day after that. Lisa started to feel anxious. "Maybe we should just move, Sam," she suggested. "I don't want to cause trouble," I replied. "This isn't about trouble," I explained. "It's about standing up to bullies. We have every right to be here." I reached out to the local news, providing evidence of discrimination and potential financial misconduct. They were interested, but needed more sources. Through a Facebook group, I connected with the Millers, who had moved away after an issue with their son's service dog. They agreed to be interviewed, and soon 3 other former residents came forward with their own stories. The reporter found out that Barbara Thompson had been sued twice before for discrimination in other communities, with the cases quietly settled under non-disclosure agreements. As I was preparing dinner one evening, Kevin Jackson knocked on my back door. "Don't react to what I'm about to tell you," he urged quietly. "I'm not just your neighbor, I'm with the FBI's white-collar crime division. We've been investigating Barbara and this HOA for months." My mouth dropped open in shock. Financial fraud across multiple HOAs, but now we're adding civil rights violations. He handed me his card. "We need your help to build our case." As I prepared to respond, a sudden crash interrupted us. We rushed to the front of the house and discovered a brick had smashed through Lisa's bedroom window, with a note attached that read, "Leave or worse." Kevin, looking serious, wasted no time calling the police. "This changes everything," he said. "Now we've got a case of criminal intimidation." While officers gathered statements and evidence, I noticed Barbara driving slowly past in her luxury SUV. Our eyes met briefly, and she offered me a chilling smile as she drove away. Turning back to Kevin, I asked, "What do you need from me?" Later that night, around 9:30 p.m., I heard a knock on my door. I cautiously looked through the blinds and saw my neighbor, Kevin Jackson, glancing nervously over his shoulder. When I opened the door, he quickly stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk about Barbara and what she did to your sister's wheelchair," he said in a hushed tone, his eyes filled with concern but wary of being overheard. My heart sank. "Did you help her do that to Lisa's chair?" I asked, ready to push him out. Kevin shook his head fervently. No, it's the opposite." He revealed a badge from his wallet. "I'm not just a retired accountant. I'm an undercover agent." I was taken aback at the thought of an FBI agent involved in a neighborhood dispute. "This goes way beyond wheelchairs and lawn ornaments," Kevin continued, lowering his voice even further. He explained that Barbara had been running a scam across 3 different neighborhoods for the past 5 years. After numerous complaints about discrimination, the FBI began investigating her 6 months ago. Barbara had been taking control of homeowners associations, altering the rules to push out families she didn't want in the neighborhood, families like mine and my sister's. "But that's not all," Kevin said grimly. "She's been siphoning off money too. The special assessments for the community pool repairs last year, half of that went straight into her pocket." I recalled writing that $800 check, struggling to afford it. "Are you serious? And no one noticed?" "She replaces board members with her friends. Anyone who questions her gets bombarded with violations until they leave," he explained. Then, he showed me pictures on his phone of Barbara meeting with contractors behind the clubhouse. "Those contractor vans outside her house? They're not just for a kitchen remodel. She's getting kickbacks from every vendor she forces the HOA to hire." Kevin just finished explaining how they're paying her for exclusive HOA contracts, and I couldn't help but think about all the changes that have taken place since Barbara became president 2 years ago. First, there was the land management company that raised our fees. Then there was that new security system nobody wanted. And let's not forget the special assessment for roof repairs that only seemed to affect her street. But what really troubled me was the incident with my sister's wheelchair. "Why would she chain it up?" I asked, feeling like it was a personal attack. Kevin's face darkened as he responded. He told me that Barbara targets anyone she perceives as driving down property values. In fact, he mentioned she had been recorded using hurtful language about people with disabilities. I felt a surge of anger when he said they had emails showing how she claimed my sister made the neighborhood look like a hospital zone. That's outrageous. Kevin explained that while her comments were appalling, they were also legal. However, the wheelchair incident gave us some strong evidence of possible violations related to the Americans with Disabilities Act (ADA). He noted we would need more proof to build a solid case against her financial misconduct. He slid a small voice recorder across the table. "We need you to get her to confess about the wheelchair incident and maybe say something about the HOA finances," he said. I hesitated. "You want me to spy on her?" He nodded. "Think of it this way. You'd be helping us build a case that could benefit many families she's targeted, but it does come with risks. Barbara has connections in the local police department." Just then, headlights illuminated my living room window. Kevin ducked and peered through the blinds. "That's her car," he whispered. This was the third time today she had driven by my home. We fell silent, watching as Barbara's luxury SUV crept slowly past, pausing momentarily before turning the corner. "She's watching you," Kevin warned. "Be careful about what you say around anyone in the neighborhood. Some might report back to her." As he got ready to leave, he paused at the door. "Think it over. If you want to help, text the word pool to the number I added to your phone. If not, I get it." After he left, I sat in the dark living room for what felt like ages. From down the hall, I could hear Lisa struggling to get from her wheelchair to her bed. She was too proud to ask for help, and the quiet sounds of her frustration made my decision clear. I picked up my phone and typed in pool. Just seconds later, I received a reply. "Meeting tomorrow, playground, 3 p.m. I stood to check on Lisa, but as I approached her room, I noticed something outside her window, a small red light blinking in the bushes across the street. Someone was watching our house. That's when I spotted Kevin. I found a spot on a bench at the community playground, acting as if I were reading a newspaper like something out of an old spy movie. As a mom with 2 young kids walked by, Kevin, who was sitting beside me, suddenly began talking loudly about baseball scores. Once they were out of earshot, he handed me a coffee cup. "The recorder is inside," he whispered. "Just press the bottom of the cup once to turn it on." While we discussed our plan, I noticed the Henderson kids playing nearby. Their mom, Judy Henderson, sat just across the way. She served on the HOA board and was a close friend of Barbara's. "Don't look now, but we're being watched," I said softly. Kevin nodded slightly. "That's why we're only talking about baseball here. To anyone else, we're just neighbors who hardly know each other." He explained that the FBI had discovered that Barbara was misusing HOA funds to cover her daughter's college tuition and her husband's golf club membership. They needed evidence linking her to these financial decisions and the intimidation tactics she used against homeowners who disagreed with her. "The meeting tonight is perfect," Kevin said, referring to the emergency HOA meeting called by Barbara. "We know she plans to announce another special assessment, this time for security cameras, but most of that money will just vanish." I frowned, unsure. "How can I get her to admit anything with the whole board there?" "You're not going to ask her directly," Kevin replied. "You're going to publicly challenge her about Lisa's wheelchair. It will make her angry, and afterward, she'll likely confront you privately. That's when you can record her." As we finished our conversation, I caught Judy Henderson glancing at us. She was pretending to focus on her kids, but it was clear she was paying attention. "She's reporting back to Barbara right now," Kevin said quietly. "Just remember, to everyone else, I'm just a friendly neighbor." That evening, I arrived at the clubhouse for the HOA meeting, coffee cup ready with the recorder and a folder filled with printouts about ADA compliance. The room was packed, with some neighbors standing against the walls. Barbara sat at the front with her 4 board members, sporting her usual fake smile. Before Barbara could begin, I called out, "I'd like to address the illegal chaining of my disabled sister's wheelchair." The room fell silent, and Barbara's smile disappeared. "That matter was handled according to HOA bylaws," she said coldly. "Your personal grievances aren't on tonight's agenda." I raised the chain that had been on Lisa's wheelchair. Discrimination against individuals with disabilities is a violation of federal law. During a recent meeting, several neighbors were taken aback when Barbara's expression changed dramatically. "Your sister's equipment was improperly restored," she snapped, as one board member, Jack Wilson, raised a point, saying, "I didn't even know we approved that." Barbara shot him a glare in response. We discussed this in private, Jack, just like we talked about the $50,000 for the clubhouse renovation that never happened, I interjected loudly. This revelation sent a ripple of confusion through the room. Many attendees appeared startled, clearly unaware of the missing renovation funds. This meeting is about security cameras, not your unfounded accusations, Barbara exclaimed, banging her gavel. She continued, we clearly need security with troublemakers like you in our community. As the atmosphere grew tense, I noticed Kevin at the back, quietly typing on his phone. Our plan was unfolding as Barbara seemed to lose her grip on the situation. After Barbara abruptly called the meeting to an end, I lingered in the parking lot, pretending to search for my keys. It wasn't long before she marched over. You've made a serious mistake, she hissed, pointing a finger at me. Your little stunt tonight will have consequences. I gripped my coffee cup. Are you threatening me? I asked, hoping to keep the conversation going. I'm promising you consequences, she replied coolly. Your sister's wheelchair was just the start. Push too far, and you might find your car towed, your trees cut down for safety violations, and fines you can't afford. I was taken aback. Why are you doing this? What did we ever do to you? She stepped closer, her voice low. People like your sister bring down property values. I've worked hard to build this community, and I'm not going to let you ruin it. Just like I got rid of the Gonzalez family and their noisy kids, or old Mrs. Wilkins with her medical equipment on the porch. I could feel my hands trembling with frustration, yet I kept recording. And what about the clubhouse renovation money? I pressed her. She shrugged slightly, a smug smile creeping on her face. Managing an HOA isn't free. Consider it my compensation for keeping undesirable people out. As she walked away, she turned back, warning, I'd start packing if I were you. By this time next month, you won't be able to afford to live here anymore. Once she drove off, I wasted no time texting Kevin, letting him know I had everything. His reply came quickly, don't go home yet, wait 30 minutes. I sat in my car, puzzled by his message, but then I saw Barbara's SUV return. Inside the clubhouse, 2 board members hurried in, carrying folders. From my vantage point through the window, I could see them emptying papers from the filing cabinets and stuffing them into bags. It felt like they were trying to erase something important. I quickly snapped photos on my phone and then ducked down as they made their way back to the parking lot. Once they left, I decided to take a longer route home, just to ensure I wasn't being followed. When I arrived, I found Lisa waiting for me, her concern evident. How did it go? She asked eagerly. Before I could reply, a loud noise startled us. Something had hit our garage door. I rushed to the window just in time to see Barbara's teenage son sprinting away after spray painting "Leave Now" on our garage. It went just as I had expected, I thought grimly, as I sent the photos and a message to Kevin. They're scared. Lisa took my hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. What happens tomorrow? She asked. Tomorrow, I replied, we spring the trap. As we turned off the lights, I noticed a car slowly parking across the street with its headlights off. It felt like someone was keeping an eye on our home. Don't look, I whispered to Lisa. I had a suspicion that the FBI wasn't the only group watching us tonight. Barbara's expression turned pale as Kevin held up his FBI badge. The fear on her face was like a child caught stealing cookies, only much worse. Barbara Thompson, Kevin announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. The FBI has been observing you and your HOA board for the past 8 months. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, the Jacksons across the street, the elderly Fosters next door, and even the Petersons stopped what they were doing to listen. This isn't what it looks like, Barbara stammered, dropping her clipboard. I'm just enforcing the rules everyone agreed to. Kevin shook his head. Rules you changed without proper votes. Rules you only enforced on select people. Rules that violate federal disability laws. More FBI agents arrived in unmarked cars. One agent handed me back a chain they had discovered in Barbara's garage, the very chain that had been used on Lisa's wheelchair. The agent informed Barbara that they had fingerprint evidence directly linking her to this chain, along with her favorite board member, Tom. We also have video evidence of you placing this chain, the agent added. I watched as Barbara's perfectly styled hair seemed to deflate. realizing she was truly cornered. Lisa rolled onto the porch, and in that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride for my sister. She looked at Barbara and said, "I thought I was the one with mobility issues, but you're the one who can't move forward with the truth." As the news van from Channel 7 arrived, I remembered calling them the night before, after Kevin gave me the go-ahead. Their reporter, Sandra Lee, rushed over with her cameraman. "Is it true that the Willow Creek HOA has been targeting disabled residents?" she asked, directing her microphone towards Barbara. Barbara quickly turned away and shouted, "No comment," trying to push past the agents. Kevin stepped in and said, "We have evidence that Mrs. Thompson and her board have embezzled over $350,000 from homeowner fees over the past 3 years." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of neighbors that had gathered. The Andersons, whose children had lost their treehouse last summer, were recording the scene on their phones. "That money was supposed to fix the community pool," Mr. Foster, who used a walker, shouted. "You said there wasn't enough in the budget." Barbara attempted to reach her car, but another agent stood in her way. "We have a warrant to search your home in the HOA office," he announced, holding up official papers. I noticed Tom Wilson and a couple of other board members trying to quietly slip away through the backyards. "Kevin, the rest of her team is escaping," I pointed out. The agents quickly apprehended them while others began searching Barbara's house. Within minutes, they carried out boxes of documents, hard drives, and, most shocking of all, a safe filled with cash and jewelry that Barbara had purchased with our money. "We found falsified ballots from the last 3 HOA elections," announced a female agent. "Barbara has been rigging votes to keep herself in power." The Petersons, who had always supported Barbara, looked stunned. "She told us our Christmas decorations were approved because they added character to the neighborhood," Mrs. Peterson admitted, "but she fined the Martinez family for their holiday lights." Kevin turned to the growing crowd. "We believe Mrs. Thompson has been targeting homeowners who questioned her authority or whom she personally disliked. She's been using selective enforcement as a weapon." As my phone buzzed with messages from neighbors I barely knew, I was surprised to see many expressing their shock and support. The community I thought had turned against me, and Lisa was, in fact, filled with people who'd been bullied into silence. That very evening, an emergency community meeting was called at the clubhouse, drawing nearly everyone from Willow Creek homes. It turned out to be the largest turnout in neighborhood history. People began sharing story after story of Barbara's injustices, and the air was thick with a mix of disbelief and solidarity. Mrs. Garcia shared her frustrations about the unfairness in our community. She mentioned how, after my break-in, she had turned down my request for a security light but approved a spotlight for her friend's backyard, which unfortunately lit up my bedroom. Mr. Patel chimed in with shocking news about Barbara. The FBI had found out that she was running a fake landscaping company, charging our HOA double what was normal. Half of that money was funneled directly into her personal accounts. They even linked her luxury car and Florida vacation home to our hard-earned money. "How did you find out about it?" someone asked. I held up a heavy wheelchair chain, explaining that it all started there. Barbara had crossed a line when she targeted someone who couldn't defend themselves. Instead of reacting with anger, Lisa and I opted to gather evidence. The crowd responded with applause. Although I was not used to being in the spotlight, it felt rewarding to advocate for not just Lisa, but for everyone in our community. That night, we formed a temporary board with a majority vote. To my surprise, I was invited to join. Mrs. Foster expressed their need for someone who stood for what was right. Just a week later, the situation escalated when Barbara, Tom, and 2 other board members were charged with serious federal crimes: fraud, embezzlement, civil rights violations, and conspiracy. They now face the potential of years in prison and heavy fines. Meanwhile, the HOA's bank accounts were frozen as forensic accountants began to trace every dollar that went missing over nearly 5 years, starting from the moment Barbara took charge. Our first official action as the new board was to establish a comprehensive accessibility policy, with Lisa serving as our consultant. While we revised our bylaws for clarity and fairness, all violation notices were put on hold. I explained to a newspaper reporter covering our story, this isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring everyone feels welcome in their neighborhood. 2 months later, a block party took place, marking a first for Willow Creek. Neighbors who had lived next to each other for years finally began to connect. Children played freely on front lawns, no longer fearing violation notices. The Martinez family's son, who, like Lisa, used a walker, showcased the new accessible playground equipment that we had been able to install with the recovered funds. As Lisa and I watched our neighbors laugh and share food, she squeezed my hand and said, "Thank you for not giving up. Some chains you can see and some you can't. We broke both." The well-known wheelchair chain now hangs in our community center, accompanied by a plaque that reads, "Freedom sometimes requires courage, community, and occasionally, the FBI." Nearby, Barbara's house stands empty, waiting to be sold. I sometimes notice neighbors glance at it as they pass by, still trying to understand how one person's actions could impact so many lives. However, most people are choosing to look ahead instead of back. Just yesterday, Lisa smoothly rolled up the gentle slope of our new community-wide pathways, racing with the neighborhood kids on their bikes.